Hey everybody, sorry it's been a long time since I did a video. Christopher Ruocchio here, author of the Sun Eater science fantasy series from Daw Books and junior editor at Baen Books, where I worked with authors like David Weber, Larry Correia, and Lois McMaster-Bujold. And joining me today is Dr. Christopher Marcus Gibson from Princeton University, professor, lecturer, question mark?
Lecturer and postdoctoral researcher.
At Princeton in classical philosophy, and cards on the table, one of my oldest and dearest friends. Marcus, thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Christopher. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I thought this would be fun because those of you who've read the Sun Eater books know, of course, or that Gibson is a character who is very important to the series. Is Hadrian's mentor, sort of the Aristotle to his Alexander, the Merlin to his Arthur. And so Marcus is, in many ways, to me. I would not have read most of the harder books that I read growing up, Dante, for instance, if Marcus had not encouraged me at perhaps too young an age to do that. I think it was fifth grade. You were like, you have to read Dante. So we read Dante in fifth grade. It's all his fault. And so, Marcus, you tell us a little bit about what it is you do up at Princeton, sort of thing that you...
Yeah, of course. It kind of in many ways goes back to those sorts of conversations and sort of intellectual explorations and imagination we used to have in middle school and high school. I really fell in love with all, the great questions that belong to all of us, the questions about the meaning, the setting and conduct of human life, who we are, where we come from, where we're going, and given the best answers we can come up to those questions as we move along, what difference they make to how we move forward in life. So my background, my training, my PhD is in classical philosophy. So both philosophical training and training in the classical languages, Greek and Latin. So I specialize in the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, but I'm very interested in general, passionate even, about Platonic and Aristotelian thinking throughout the intellectual history of the West. And I think about them as living issues, living questions that can still make a difference and bear fruit for us in our lives today.
Yeah, and by contrast, I sort of went into classics, proper. I did, the Greek and Roman theater because I've always been more interested in narrative and depicting these things sort of in motion, as it were. The science fiction, of course, which is what I do, is engaged with a lot of these questions too. Just in, I guess, maybe lower resolution is not quite the right way to put it, but in a different way, trying to engage with a lot of the same questions, just with laser swords and wizards and these things. A lot of, for those listening who've read the books, a lot of Hadrian's more philosophical digressions have come directly out of conversations that I've had with Marcus. Like I said, I named the character in honor of him. The scholiasts all take the names of scholars from antiquity. We, of course, live in Hadrian's antiquity. So Gibson is quite self-consciously named after my friend here. And so we were going to talk a little bit about the relationship between, the philosophy, the academic stuff, and the more narrative stuff that I've been doing with the stories, because, as I say, Marcus has been, you've been kind of a real help getting through some of the trickier stuff, because I don't have exactly the same sort of rigorous philosophical backgrounding. It was much more of a hobby for me.
And it's been a pleasure and a thrill to be along for the ride, of course.
Well, I really appreciate having it, because there's really a temptation to think that authors do all of this by ourselves, right? And I have a lot of people who are sort of experts who will do things. You remember Wes, who was our fencing teacher growing up, checks a lot of my action scenes. I've been taking boxing from him too, and that really influenced a lot of the way that I write combat scenes as well. And so I think the thing that we kind of wanted to talk about is something that I've gotten in some trouble with especially the second book in the series, Howling Dark, which has our friend Karn on it. We'll get there, I guess. And that's this question of what humanity is, what a human is, right? Because Hadrian's universe and the story in general asks a lot of these questions, because there are people who use machines or genetic engineering to modify their humanity, to transcend it, they might say, to destroy it, some others might say. And so there is this question of where that line is, sort of mind body stuff, and I think that's most of what we wanted to get into.
Absolutely.
And I wonder what the best way to get into that is going to be. For those who haven't read the books, it's set about 20,000 years in the future in this galactic empire that is very sort of reactionary. A long time ago, artificial intelligence has sort of almost wiped out humankind for one reason and another. And humanity has tried ever since to stay away from that kind of thing. And they've built this empire that very strongly regulates any explorations into human modification, transhumanism, artificial intelligence, cybernetics, and cybernetic implants. And there are people who flee from the empire specifically to investigate these things. And where I've gotten into trouble is I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I don't think that one can just upload their brain to a computer and be the same person. This is sort of like a popular sci-fi thing, right? So where are you on the basic premise that you could copy your brain into a machine, like in that old Cowboy Bebop episode? Migrate.
That old Bebop episode. Exactly.
Yeah.
You want to tell our viewers about no?
No, they've probably seen Cowboy Bebop, but briefly, they do exactly that, right? They decide they're going to migrate their consciousness to the internet,
Right.
because what's the difference? And that's the tendency of most science fiction, right? Is to think that there's not really a difference. You copy the data into a computer and you get to keep going. Only, I don't think that either of us are convinced that's the case, right?
Yeah. Usually, I think. Well, maybe not usually, you'd know better than I do, but it seems to me that in science fiction, speculative fiction, often it's depicted as if there are no trade-offs, like we have nothing to lose and everything to gain, like we could get rid of scarcity or perceived scarcity, or we could sort of engineer out all of the things about our experience that seems problematic or wrong or just undesirable, and we'd have nothing to lose. We'd be able to keep all of the good things about our experiences. And that's a good segue to sort of answering the question you gave me a little while ago, which is sort of where do I fall on the spectrum? I think that both are, if you like, spiritual or intellectual or cognitive and our material embodied animal aspects are sort of equally indispensable. Folks who have some background or have been exposed to the philosophical ways of thinking in the past may recognize that this is a middle way between, on the one hand, a Descartes style full board dualism, where you think that there is a complete substantial difference between mind and body, and you think that what we are is just the mind, and the relationship between our minds and our bodies is something like the relationship between us and our clothing, or a pilot and his ship, to use the sort of older Platonic and Aristotelian image. So that's one alternative I want to avoid. And the other alternative would be to say either that we are simply material beings, simply on a par with non-human animals, and that sort of our other capacities for thinking and imagination and articulated discourse and the like, that all of those are somehow just especially elaborated forms of the more basic capacities that we see in non-human animals. I want to steer a middle course between that, Scylla and Charybdis. I think that both are intellectual powers, some even say spiritual powers, but what they mean by that is our capacity to think, to reason, to make decisions on the basis of reasoning, our capacity to imagine and to sort of recombine our imagination in rich and complex ways, in the ways that you do so delightfully for us, Christopher, that all of those powers are distinctive of us. They make us what we are, but equally so, those powers, the specific and concrete ways we carry them out. So think of the particular stories that have developed over the millennia all over the world and have staying power, the things that really captivate us over the centuries. The forms of life and thought that have endured most of all. All of that is really not separable from the particular concrete way that we're embodied, the particular histories that we've all sort of the collective we, lived through over the millennia. You cannot so easily factor those out and keep them, all those sort of intellectual and cognitive, experiential items, independently of the material, embodied, historical factors that I was describing.
Right. So you're, just make sure I'm following right. The basic idea is that a lot of what makes us human is a consequence of the hardware that we're operating on. Basically, our brains, yes, but also, you know, the rest of us, our hands, for instance, right? And the way we can interact with the world through the senses, sort of helps build not just how we think, but how we perceive everything, right? All the way down to the sort of the language level, how we've constructed reality around ourselves is a consequence of our body as well. And just to dispose of that, as so many of my fellow science fiction writers are perfectly comfortable and willing to do, throws a lot of that out. Is that basically what you're saying, or would throw some of that out, or am I leading?
That's very much of a piece with what I'm describing.
Yeah.
There are two thoughts, sort of cautionary notes, and that's not to dispense with everything that goes under the label of transhumanism or sort of that sort of science fiction aspiration to sort of see, test, probe the limits of human potential. I mean, in some ways, even sort of the moon landing could be subsumed under that sort of science fiction imaginary, right? Some space exploration and the like. But there are two cautionary notes for that sort of impulse. One is sort of the trade-off thing I mentioned earlier. There are goods we now have that could be lost or put in danger with some sort of options, some trajectories in that sort of transhumanist impulse. So that's the sort of goods are at stake that we might lose caution. And there's a second caution, which is simply that it may not be strictly possible for us to remain ourselves if we go in for something like that. In the same way that, you know, when, well, how should I put this? If I melt down a statue that's a likeness of Hermes to tap into my stock of ancient Greek philosophy examples, then Hermes is no longer there. The statue has lost its identity. The substrate is still there. The bronze is still there, but the statue's no more. In the same way, I would argue, I favor a view on which, and I recommend it for your attention, if we were to attempt to upload our minds into computers, like in that episode of Cowboy Bebop, or to do something like your Extrasolarians and try to sort of download my brain into some sort of bizarre robot, octopus or spider, I might not be left over. That chimera, that new creation might bear some really interesting relationship to me. It might resemble me in all sorts of ways. It might act in all sorts of ways that are clearly only to be explained in terms of the causal relationship that it bears to my memory and my imagination and my beliefs and desires and all that. But I contend that it wouldn't be me. And at the very least, I recommend you think twice about whether it would be you, whether you really would survive that kind of radical transformation.
Right. Certainly not unscathed, right? You know, you're moving your brain into something else. If actually, if you're not just copying the mind, right? If you actually are moving a piece, you're literally scathed. You know, you've been surgically altered to some degree, and that is traumatizing.
Yeah, good point. We are running together all sorts of different cases of radical transhuman or post-human scenarios here.
Yeah.
So there are details. There are details.
Well, that's the statue, right? You know, you could maybe cut Hermes' head off the statue, right, and plug it onto some weird modern art blob that you've made, and it's not quite Hermes anymore.
Right.
But they would put it in a museum somewhere and spend too much money on it.
Just to make Marcel Duchamp happy and his followers. That's right.
Oh man, damn bicycle stool. So what got me thinking about this way back was not actually talking about philosophy. It was and I can't remember the actual example or who did the study, the details. But when they were trying to do artificial intelligence back in the 60s and stuff early on, when science fiction was sort of in its I guess new wave by then, but its golden age, they thought it would be really easy to get computers to sort of look at objects and see, oh, here's my hourglass, right, or my mouse, but they couldn't get the machines to actually perceive the distinction between objects until they started doing the whole Boston Dynamics thing and giving machines actual means for interacting with the world. And that's what sort of started to shape their perception so they could find the hourglass or whatever item that it was. And so when I started doing the Extra Solarians, because book one in the series is set really strongly within the Empire, right? It's has almost an epic fantasy historical fiction feel to it. And then in the second book, we move out further from the center, and there are weirder things, edge of the map, right? Strange monsters like you see in medieval iconography. And one of the things that they'll do is sort of play with who they are in ways that would be unthinkable in the sort of more stolid traditionalist empire. They'll, like we're saying, they'll put their brains into strange things. And that, my sense has always been, at minimum, that even if it doesn't destroy who you are, it's going to radically alter your thinking. I think I read it, and I sometimes wonder if I imagine things that I'm remembering. I think I read a study once about a rat that they connected to a human hand with electrodes, like
Sounds vaguely familiar.
A mechanical hand. I don't remember if that was a story that I read or a study, but it altered the rat's approach to problem solving, to like getting food out of like a puzzle box, right? Because it had access to new hardware. This is one of the things that I really like about Spider-Man 2, right? Dr. Octopus gets the robot arms plugged in.
Arms, yeah, that's right.
And it changes who he is very fundamentally, not just in terms of how he can interact with getting the cheese out of the box, so to speak, if he were the rat, but it backfeeds and alters his personality, and he develops a sort of schizophrenic relationship with the implants. And it was that sort of thing, the realization that changing the body alters the mind because they are ingrained in one another, that really was behind the world building here. And it seems so strange to me that people think in this sort of purely Cartesian way, that they think they can do that, they could just move onto a computer and still be Jim or Sally and not become Jim or Sally, who is now a strange thing that lives on the computer and has access to all this information, because the new embodiment would fundamentally alter that reality. I lost my train of thought. It's been one of those weeks.
Yeah, I mean, the thought that the object discernment thing being in the Boston Dynamics case that you mentioned earlier is really interesting. The idea that even our ability to re-identify objects, what I would call substances, a particular hourglass is the example you used, this delightful mug out of which I'm drinking my tea, my ability to cognize them as individuals, as objects, object permanence, all that sort of thing, and differentiate from among them. The idea that all of those cognitive achievements would be dependent on the way I get around in the world, the way I cope with my environment, to use the Heideggerian term of art. That's really striking. That seems to me to at least be a data point that speaks in favor of the idea that in general, our mental life is simply not separable from the concrete embodiment that we have developed and now enjoy over the course of evolutionary history.
So you would suppose then, say, to move away from the extras for a moment, to move away from cyborgs and things, that if, or would you suppose that if we encountered an alien species that was radically different than us physically, even, or not even necessarily radically, but even subtly, if they were different in specific ways, they might construct a completely different sort of philosophy, teleology, epistemology, all these, they would generate a completely different philosophy as a consequence of the difference in their embodied nature, do you think? Or do you think that they might, they'd replicate a lot of the same things that we had?
My answer is a resounding, it depends. But having said that, I mean, you see just the diversity of worldview, of outlook, of ways of carving up values and sort of fields of knowledge, to say nothing of the particular views people have in those fields of knowledge. You mentioned teleology and epistemology, even in our world, among human beings.
For sure.
The great world religions, think of Aristotle's thought and all of his descendants, Plato and Aristotle, think of Confucian thought, think of the Buddhist thought. All of those, they have points of convergence, but they also equally so have radical ways of diverging, not just in what they think, what they claim, what they teach, but also in the questions that they ask, that they favor, their priorities in terms of intellectual life and worldview. And that's just human beings. Supposing that we human beings in some far-flung millennia come across other, let's say, rational life in some other corner of the universe with a very different biological makeup, maybe they're very pale and tall and and the like. That's a reference to the book. I'm not just interested in pallor and tallness.
And horns,
Horns, thank you, yes, and incredibly impressive teeth. Then it could very well be that because of such biological differences, they might, and not just the biological differences, but sort of their niche in the world, they might come up with and sort of filter through a very different set of ideas and questions and values and the like, to be sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry. I feel like I've been leading the witness. I'm so terrible at interviews. I'm
just reassessing.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to touch all the bases we've been talking about, maybe covering for weeks, and I think that I've done myself some damage there. But
that was a beautiful segue, and I also just, now that you mentioned the leading the witness thing, I guess that's my cue to insert a little footnote here, which is that I wouldn't by any means want to suggest by what I just said that I think we're kind of biologically determined to have certain ideas any more than we're ecologically determined or economically determined. These are real factors, and I think the history, I mean, if you look at sort of pre-modern and early modern ways of thinking about intellectual history to the degree that folks did, I think that they tended to undervalue or underrate the extent to which those factors could make a difference to how we think. And now we have at our disposal much richer ways of being able to recognize and appreciate the roles that biology, history, ecology and the like, economics, as I said before, do play a role, but it's a role. I don't mean to say that we're determined to think the way that we do.
Right. Undervalue. Can you give an example?
Undervalue what?
Undervalue these factors in what way exactly? I'm just.
Are you referring to what I said about sort of earlier ways of thinking about intellectual history?
What you were just talking about how the tendency had been to undervalue these sorts of factors.
I see, yeah.
I was wondering if give an example of that sort of thing.
Sure. Concrete example. Let me think. I would just point to when you read earlier philosophers, and I'm thinking of ancient, late antique, and medieval, and maybe early modern too. In general terms, when they look back on their predecessors, they tend to think in terms of the arguments primarily. And that's very important if what you're doing is trying to get straight on what the arguments were and whether they're good arguments. And that's the bread and butter of philosophy, and it's very important, of course. But as sort of the field of human knowledge has expanded and diversified, and what were branches of philosophy became sciences and fields of inquiry in their own right, people began to appreciate more and more the extent to which thinking is also influenced by those other factors I was describing.
Oh, okay. But like putting the philosopher in context historically.
For example, and we don't even need to think just of individual philosophers and their views, but also sort of intellectual traditions in general and sort of the values of society, that kind of big picture thinking.
Okay, I think I understand. So in the sense that, like, say, you get movements like during the French Revolution. There's this sort of moment, and all of this confluence of factors that generate this idea. All the ideas that sort of percolate around the revolution as a sort of inflection point, and all of the different factors that create that moment in time create also the sort of schools of thought that materialize in that environment.
Yeah, and
Okay.
So what I've been saying is that it would just be a mistake to think that those changes were all purely the result of folks having the concepts of liberty, fraternity, and equality, which they didn't have before. Of course, that's I mean, it's a cartoonishly impoverished way to think about it. But my point is just that there was also all the sort of economic and social, cultural factors in play as well.
Right. It's just not the case that philosophy was happening in a vacuum.
Right. Like I thought in high school that the history of the Western world was a history of ideas, and sort of, that you could explain away all the sort of medieval and early modern and late modern.
I, of course, thought the same thing about storytelling when I was growing up too. Right. I remember I was doing a mock interview because when I worked for NC State's housing over the summers, they paid us, but in order to compensate for the fact that they didn't really pay us, they gave us these mandatory enrichment opportunities. One of them was a mock interview, so we could practice for getting jobs, right? And I botched the damn thing because they asked me who I looked up to, and it was all writers. And I was like, why is it all writers? And I realized that I had this idea that of the writer.
A little bit
right.
of turbulence here.
Oh, on the signal?
I'm back. I had a little bit of a hiccup, but I'm here. Okay.
Okay, good.
So
now I have the turbulence.
Watch the interview because they ask you. I'm sorry.
It broke up. It broke up on my end too that time. Bad signal, folks. But no. So I botched the interview because I got really invested in this idea that all the people I admired were writers, and I realized at the time that it was because I thought they were, a world apart in a sense, sort of commenting on everything, even I don't want to say allegorically, but even symbolically. And then I realized when I arrived in sort of the science fiction industry that was not the case. These are people who are perhaps too acutely, in some cases, involved in current events to the point where I worry about some people's health. And that nothing really happens in a vacuum, which I think is where a lot of the arguments in culture about art being political come from, right? The degree to which that is true. Because certainly you can just write a book to entertain, and that's always been my primary focus. But to pretend that even the ideas that I have are operating in a vacuum is, of course, also totally untrue. So let's see. I did want to ask, because I've never actually asked you this, because of course Karnes Agora is a character in the books whose name I stole from you in middle school. What did you think of him since I borrowed the name in your honor? As I borrow,
I'm delighted. He could never have possibly been realized with greater splendor or sinister aplomb than you did in that book. I'm just delighted. I mean, really, I'm very glad to have shared the name with you, Karnes Agora. What do I think of him? Well, I just told you.
Yeah.
But I'll say some more. He's like Lucifer in Paradise Lost. He's like this great brooding titanic figure in the depths of his castle world. I love him. And I love the way that you sort of brought out these other details in his character, like his love for to them ancient earth art and the like. I remember there's like a triptych right in the scene where Hadrian confronts him in his cave throne room in the bowels of Borgosos. That's right. And I just love that. A triptych that he got from some altar. Is it a particular altar, Christopher? Is there a particular church you had in mind, or was
I don't think there is. No, it was just a sort of genericized version of a bunch of those triptychs that I've seen.
I love those details.
They're really cool. But no, the reason I ask, right, is because a lot of what I do, a lot of what I think art is, right, is agglomerative and referential. And so there is, there are references to other books that I've read, to theology, mythology, philosophy, all of these things, but also to like, my personal life. And, as I've said, you've helped a lot, right, in formulating the series. And so I had wondered, if I'd wondered what you thought about these things, because we weren't exactly the same sort of people in middle school that we were now, right? This is sort of like in a lot of ways, is sort of the result of the sort of edgier things that we thought in high school and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because we used to do all these sort of role playing games, right? And I think you and I almost invariably played villains.
Yeah. You're bringing us around to the thing I was just reflecting on, which is that Karnes Agora, my invented Karnes Agora from middle school. I think I started using that name in 5th grade. Actually, it was very much. I mean, he was like the protagonist of my fantasies, my stories and role playing games and all that stuff. But he was not a good guy exactly. He was, he was usually an emperor of. So I won't say it was exactly like Vorgos's. I mean, first of all, Vorgos's is much richer than anything I was thinking about back then in storytelling. But it was sort of flavor-wise, yeah, there was a bit of that sort of sinister galactic conqueror kind of thing going on.
Yeah, no, I just it's sort of a weird homage, right? That like, oh, it's my friend, and I'm making his vision the bad guy.
That's okay. You've already, Tor Gibson is already such a delightful form of praise that I'm so honored by, that I don't mind that you take my shadow and turn him into Karnes Agora.
Yeah.
You have carte blanche as far as I'm concerned.
All right. No, sorry about that, folks. I had a call there real suddenly. So anyway, gosh, where were we?
Well, we were talking about kind of what I thought of Karnes Agora.
Oh yeah.
The protagonist of Volume 2, but also sort of in general the sort of background to sort of the imaginative resources you drew upon to create some parts of the series, and especially Howling Dark.
You mean our stupid games from high school?
Yeah, a lot of that. Hey, I love collaborative storytelling. It's great, man. Don't knock it. I love it.
Yeah, it's just weird, right? Because you don't think that a lot of books would emerge from like internet forum games, but I'm learning like more and more that there's actually a lot of writers sort of this generation that did exactly that.
It makes perfect sense.
Well, it does, but like we grew up sort of in a vacuum, so to speak, right? We weren't aware of other people that were as weird as we were in middle school, especially when there were 30 of us.
Right. Yeah. We weren't thinking about how there must have been all sorts of folks our age in other parts of the world doing similar things, online and offline, storytelling, role playing, all that stuff.
Yeah, because I
and now they're writing books.
What?
And now they're writing books.
It's weird. Because like for example, I was just thinking, that Karn and his robot was a reference to the Digimon game I think we played in middle school, where I think it was you had a robot butler, and I was like,
Oh yeah, that's right. Yes, that rings a bell. Absolutely. There was an Andromon or something that was like the manservant or the droid servant, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just funny because the books are written out of all these references, right? And And it's
It's like
almost,
TSL Wasteland, but instead of being about the demise of Western, intellectual and artistic history, it's about us. It's about
it
us.
might be more like T.S. Eliot's cat poems, which are exclusively about his godchildren and their cats, and no one else is really going to understand what the hell is going on.
Well, I
Um,
dearly hope that your musical and film adaptation turn out much better, because I will veto it otherwise.
I think I would veto it otherwise.
I'm sure you would before me, I'm sure.
Oh, I had to see that when I was on the honeymoon with Jenna, because we got married just a couple months ago, and they played Cats on the cruise, and it was the most
Oh, dare
surreal, terrifying experience of my life.
they? In
Um,
an enclosed space where people couldn't get away from each other for like several weeks, what were they thinking?
no,
What were they thinking?
there's no escape. I think hundreds of people jumped off the boat.
Makes
Um,
sense.
well, we have descended far from the heights of Aristotelian dualism.
Yeah. It's all right, though.
Yeah, no, like I said, I'm not an interviewer at all. I just thought this would be fun.
It's part of the great time. Yeah.
Is no, what I wanted to do to get back to Karnes, I suppose, was to sort of play this philosophy all the way to its extreme, because Karnes is someone who's lived for thousands of years and who treats his bodies as eminently disposable and plastic. He'll change because he's bored after all that experience. He'll change bodies radically between incarnations. As one grows old, he'll sort of, bootstrap it with more and more hardware, life support systems and stuff, until it runs out, and then he'll move on to something new. His name is literally, it's Karn, right? It's meat.
Yeah.
And so he is sort of supposed to be one extreme here. He was totally at the dualist end of this. He's sort of, I guess he is sort of Descartes' evil genius, right? He's sort of put himself in a bottle, and he'll swap bottles as he gets.
Oh, that's a nice way to play with the imagery. Yeah, absolutely. Sort of conjuring his own world of experience out of all of these different meat suits. Oh, it's even more radical than the picture I gave earlier, where it's like my mind relates to my body the way I relate to my clothing, right? It's even more radical than that, because we probably treat our clothes a lot better than Karn, and less disposably than Karn treats his bodies, right? I mean,
Yeah, because he he does. He sort of throws them out, and he keeps them on reserve all the time.
Yeah, copies them when he wants to, sort of patches it here and there, the way you might patch a movie. Wait, let's not go back in that direction. The way you might patch a game or a website. It's radically disposable and fungible. That's right.
Yeah, and the sort of, I guess, what I wanted to do with the character too, right? And this is something people who will have who've read book 2 will notice, right? Is that when he does change bodies, that I have him start to act differently as a consequence of his new embodiedness. Because when we meet him, he's very old and he's starting to run down, and he's prone to like like a dementia patient. He doesn't answer for really long periods of time and things like that. He's still all there. But what I was hoping to show, right, as he moves into a younger body, or 2 at the end of the book, he starts to act in new ways because the brain chemistry is different, because the body is younger. All of these things, it changes the way that he works. I don't know if it's because it's only for a couple chapters at the end of the book. I don't know if it's very subtle yet, but that's something that I'm really interested in sort of working with, is that the nature of his embodiment and the nature of other characters who move around like him changes as a consequence of sort of the hardware, I guess, to use the computer metaphor, that they're operating on changes. Then yeah.
Sorry, complete your point. I don't want to.
Oh no, that's okay. I thought it made a noise because of the signal lag.
Got it. Yeah, that's really striking. I mean, I'd noticed that to some degree before. It's kind of, if I'm remembering what you've told me confidentially in the past, so some big plot points hinge upon the fact that new body means, to some degree, new personality for Karn, and that's really striking, actually. Sort of even at the level of finer details, like sort of the dramatic slowness with which he responds to Hadrian in Howling Dark when they confront each other. That being a result of the extent to which his perception of time has probably completely changed over the centuries, so that, the flow of normal conversation doesn't look to him the way it would to us. Yeah, that's striking.
But this is the sort of thing you were talking about, right? When we're talking about the sort of gradation of division from the Cartesian on the one hand to the, I guess not monist, but
in a way, it's a kind of monism. It's thinking that all that we are is our bodies, and that everything else can sort of be reduced to our bodies, or we can eliminate informative talk that appeals to stuff other than our bodies. In a way, actually, I think it can be surprising how those two extremes wrap around to many similar conclusions when it comes to other questions. And sometimes you end up with extremes on both ends, extreme materialism and extreme sort of Cartesian dualism, both treating the particulars of our embodied life in a kind of cavalier or disposable way. I'm speaking, of course, in general terms about sort of intellectual culture and sociology and values and all that sort of thing. And all of this is that you're describing when you talk about your depiction of Karn points to how things are more complicated than that.
Right. Gosh, no, sorry. I lost my point again.
Are we talking about sort of Karn's different embodiments, or?
Yeah, well, all right, and we're back again, folks. Sorry about that. I thought that I had told everybody that I was doing this right now, but keep getting interrupted. I think it was before the pause, but it might have been during. Marcus, you said that that you had a question that you wanted to talk about. What was that? Is ball rolling again?
You bet. So this is going back towards the beginning of our conversation when you gave us the background for why, in the time of the empire Hadrian is living through, the attitudes, sort of the official attitudes and the laws, are so anti-artificial intelligence and so anti-human enhancement, but also why sort of grassroots-wise people are so against it as well, why sentiments or attitudes are so against it. I think you and I both agree that those attitudes are in part protecting human beings from routes that would actually endanger the great good that human life and human experience is. But I wanted to ask you, do you also think that in the time of the empire and the world you've created that Hadrian is living through and sort of ushering in these historic events in, are those attitudes and those laws also holding human beings back from genuine goods, genuine worthwhile opportunities that they could be pursuing? Is it cutting both ways, in other words?
Probably, but I think the best way to answer that question is from a craft perspective, right? Because a lot of contemporary sort of pop science thinkers think that we're about 30 seconds or 200 years from some kind of singularity, right? Like the Ray Kurzweil thing, that everything is about to change in ways that we can't possibly predict. And I wanted to tell a story about people. And in order to tell a science fiction story about people, I needed to write a future that looked enough like the past or the present to be relevant to the human condition as we understand it. If those science thinkers, right, the scientists, the pop science guys, even science fiction writers, are right in any way about how the future is going to be radically, radically different, or that it's about to radically change in ways that we won't recognize, then I needed a way to sidestep it. And so I created a society that agitates against progress technologically, especially, in as much as is possible. There are certainly trade-offs, but I think if I were a solemn imperial citizen, I would say that they have safeguarded a future for humanity as anyone who is currently human would recognize it, because I didn't want to do the sort of Charles Stross post-human, Peter Hamilton post-human sort of sci-fi story where everybody's got all these weird extra glands and they've got, this crazy biotech that they're all integrated with, and they don't really approach problems the same way we do, or approach philosophy the same way we do, or think and feel the same way. And so, of course, there are trade-offs, right? And a lot of what I want to do with the series is sort of interrogate the line between how far you can push human progress without ceasing to be human.
Ceasing to be progress.
Exactly. Same thing. Because I think that,
right, of course.
I think that progress that pushes us past the point of being human isn't really progress anymore. Because I think we should be our best selves and not someone else. Right. And I think that becoming an 8-foot metal spider is probably not being me anymore, is my general feeling, as cool as being Dr. Octopus might be. It clearly wasn't good for Dr. Octopus in Spider-Man 2 to be in that position. He died for it, despite, not being a bad guy when that movie started. And that's why I like Spider-Man 2 so much. Anthony, if you're watching, this is for you.
Thank you all. That's right.
Our friend Anthony is a big Spider-Man 2 fan, and I think rightly so. But no. So I think that the basic idea, right, is that there is a line, and I don't know exactly where it is, and that's why I want to be a storyteller, not a philosopher, because I don't actually have to answer these questions. I can just sort of build a situation, and then describe what happens, and then the audience can draw differential conclusions from that. And I'm hoping that as hundreds and, God willing, thousands of people read the books, they're able to arrive at an answer for me, as it were, by simply posing the questions. And I think that by posing questions people don't ask, right? Because like a lot of science fiction writers think that you could just, migrate to anywhere else, put yourself in a computer, and you'll be you, and you can live forever and play Second Life. And I've seen Second Life, and I don't think that making my avatar a weird cartoon squirrel or a dragon and living that existence on the internet, which sounds crazy, I know, is going to be the same as living an ordinary life in the real world. I don't think that I would be the same person making those decisions, right? And I don't think if I got a third arm that grew out of my shoulder and had, a sword on the end of it, that I would think the same way, because I could do different things with that body, right, than I could do with mine. If I went all Deus Ex and had a gun built into my hand, I would definitely want to use it, right? That would impact the way that I thought. And I'm being silly, but that's how I reason is ridiculously. So,
well, images are important. You can't think without an image. That's an old slogan that goes all the way back to Aristotle's De Anima, his treatise on the soul. You can't think without images. We're constantly drawing upon our imagination in sort of prosaic ways, but also in quite elaborate and sophisticated ways, as we're doing right now, appealing to the treasures of science fiction, to think about these questions and their implications and how they could spill out and make a difference into how we lead our lives. And that's really indispensable. I think you're being provocative in the best sense, which is to say that these stories provoke people to think a little more concretely about those sorts of questions, maybe considering alternatives that they wouldn't have been so inclined to consider otherwise.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. I guess
it's great fun as well, which is also, don't knock having great fun. That's really important.
Well, that really is the point, right? For as much as I like to dress up the science fiction stories, right, as philosophical exercises, right, as explorations of deep questions, at the end of the day, the most important thing for me as an artist is that I am entertaining. And I hope those of you who are listening who haven't checked out the book might be inclined to do so if you've survived this long through our antics. Mostly mine. Marcus has been civilized. I have been a mess.
I don't know if you can call it that, but it's great fun.
And I hope that those of you who have read the books, feel the same way, as I want you to be entertained first and to think about these things later. Because if you're thinking about things while you're reading, as opposed to having fun first,
Yeah.
it's a different experience. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
Maybe do both at the same time. But anyway, Marcus, thanks for coming on and dealing with my scattered. It's been a long few weeks, I think, for everybody. For me in particular, I had a lot of personal stuff going on, so that's why there haven't been any videos on the channel in a while. So thank you. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's been a great pleasure, and it's always fun to talk and catch up.
Yeah, man, and we'll do it again soon when my head is screwed on correctly, I think.
Sounds great. I'm looking
Awesome.
forward to it.
All right, we'll see you then.
Take care.
You too.